ladies and gentlemen. Welcome, everybody, to the 2016 Aspen Ideas Festival. This is our 12th Ideas Festival. And I have to say, we're so excited, it's ridiculous. I could use some language that some people used this morning in the final closing about how ridiculous it is, but I won't use that. I'm going to be back in a bit, but we've been planning this event for a year, and we want to get going. So, it is my great pleasure to introduce to you a friend, a trustee of the Aspen Institute, the president and CEO of the Woodrow Wilson Center for Scholars, Jane Harman, and our very, very honored guest, Christine Lagarde, managing director of the International Monetary Fund. Would you join us on this stage?
Well, good afternoon, everyone. Can we please give a shout out for Kitty Boone? No way, with all affection for Walter and the team, no way this could happen without her magic. So I'm delighted to be back and delighted to be part of the first act. The reason this has happened, you may know, something happened last week. A big vote. It wasn't in the United States, but Christine was actually coming last year. And at the last minute, there was a family event, and she had to cancel. So we decided she would come this year, a year's lead time. Nothing would interfere with Christine and Xavier coming to Aspen. No way. Middle of last week, I get a text. Cherie, there's this vote. And if it passes, I may have to delay or cancel my trip to Aspen, but it probably won't pass. And remember, the day of, most people thought it had tipped and it wouldn't pass. So at 4 a.m. on Friday, junkie that I am, I turn on my television. Oh my God, 5 a.m. text from Christine. Cherie, I have to, emergency meetings, I have to delay and may have to cancel my visit to Aspen. So I thought she did predict this, how sad, so canceled a bunch of things, but headed to Aspen anyway, landed in Aspen to find that she managed to come. And has to leave early, so Walter had this brilliant idea that we would hold this event early, and the 800 of you who are in the first session get the whole advantage of this, and so do I. So, Christine Lagarde is a dearest friend. I'm totally objective when I say she's one of the most admired women on the planet. Do we agree? She was just elected unanimously, get that, to her second 5-year term as the director of the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, the first woman to hold that position. She also was the first woman to be finance minister of a G7 country. She also was the first woman to chair a major international law firm. Not bad. So the markets are opening in Asia, I believe I'm correct. And there are Brexperts everywhere. Good new word. I read it, I didn't make it up. Who are saying catastrophe, the UK will fall, the EU will fall, the UK has opportunities, the EU has opportunities, these countries will leave, so on and so forth. The markets obviously were down on Friday. My first question to you, my friend, is Brexit a catastrophe or an opportunity or both?
Thank you very much, Jane, for this easy one. Thank you very much. On behalf of my husband and myself, I'd like to really thank the Aspen community. We've been here for less than 48 hours, and we've only met lovely, nice, warm-hearted, welcoming, hospitable people, not to mention, of course, Jane and Bob, my friends. But really, thank you so much. It feels so good to be here. Jane, what I thought I would do is just start with a few numbers and put things in perspective a little bit, because there is a lot of either short memories or rush to a few conclusions, which I think is not necessarily the wisest thing to do at the moment. So, looking at numbers a little bit, I think we have to keep in mind that the European Union, which started being constructed over 50 years ago, represents roughly 500 million people and is the largest free market economic zone in the world. That's what the UK is considering at the moment. The UK itself is a country with over 60 million people, GDP per capita at around 45,000, a pretty good track record of economic policy in the last few years, with unemployment down at about 5%, growth ranging from 2.2 to 1.9 and up, and public finances that have been largely re-established and a good direction in terms of debt to GDP. So that's the economic situation of that country at the moment. And I'm saying that with a particular purpose, which will be, as you will understand, the questions that I have at the end of my quick look around. Second set of facts which I think are important is that on Friday, as we all sort of woke up to this news, which was heartbreaking for those of us who are truly Europeans, and certainly it was very much my sentiment as a European. But when we woke up, we realized that, first of all, the markets had vastly underestimated the outcome. And contrary to what I hear all the time from my teams, which is essentially markets usually get it pretty right and anticipate reasonably well, on this particular occasion, whether it was the bookmaker or the markets, that was not anticipated very much, which will explain something that I will say in a minute. That's point number one. Point number two, it might just be the case that the experts, much criticized, including by Justice Minister Gove, they just might be right. And it's not necessarily going to be the best news in the world. Third, on that Friday, in the course of the day, there was no panic, right? And despite the fact that markets had not anticipated that vote, and therefore had priced in asset values and other currency values the fact that the UK would probably remain, which led to a nice increase on the markets in the days preceding the referendum. Well, despite that, there was no panic. There was a violent, brutal, immediate, massive move. You know, the pound went down by 10%. It caught up a little bit later on in the day. The valuations, went down in many corners, and some people lost a lot of money. Other people made a lot of money, as is often the case when there is massive volatility. But there was no panic, and the central bankers did the job that they were prepared to do just in case, which was to put a lot of liquidity on the markets so that there would not be shortage of liquidity and no sort of fading away of those liquidities as we saw it on previous occasions, particularly in 2008. So that's the first take. Central bankers did their job. All groupings, organizations, eminent policymakers came out publicly along the same lines of trying to reassure that the situation was under control, and it was very much under control. We didn't see those sort of panic move. Now, having said that, clearly what we are facing in terms of, and I'm coming to your question, risk opportunities or threats opportunities, I think needs to be distinguished in terms of short-term longer term. And we have done a lot of forecast analysis, as have many other institutions. And our conclusions, which I have shared with British public opinions, not too much success, was that the outcome would not be a very happy story for the British people, both in terms of trade, declining, in terms of productivity, probably declining, in terms of income, in terms of inflation, and so on and so forth. But very much of that outcome, which is not terribly precisely predictable, is going to depend on the level of certainty or uncertainty, predictability or lack of predictability. People going in a risk-off mode or considering that the situation is going to settle back or not. So I think that at this point in time, policymakers, both in the UK and in Europe, are holding that level of uncertainty in their hands. And how they come out in the next few days is going to really drive the direction in which risk will go. Now, we are hearing at the moment, and I'm not inventing it, different statements going a little bit in many directions. There is uncertainty in the political party situation in the UK, both in the Labour and in the Conservative Party. There is a timetable that has been announced under which this referendum, which was legally of an advisory value, is leading to the resignation of the Prime Minister, which will only be effective at the time when he's actually replaced by his successor, who will be appointed by the Conservative meeting, which will take place probably after the holiday, which will be in the course of September. So early October, we will know who is the next leader of the Conservative Party. And in the meantime, Prime Minister Cameron has indicated that he was not going to trigger this famous Article 50 of the European Treaty, which provides for the terms under which withdrawal can be actually notified and organized. But there has been no withdrawal from the European Union, except some 30 years ago by Greenland, which left from Denmark, literally. There is no precedent. There is no real history of how these things happen. So certainly from our perspective as the IMF, we have very strongly encouraged and will continue to encourage the parties involved to actually proceed with this transition in the most efficient, predictable way in order to reduce the level of uncertainty, which will itself determine the level of risk that we are facing. Having said that, in the long term, if the decision was maintained and if the leave is effectively followed through by a withdrawal from the United Kingdom, there is no doubt that it will have an economic impact on that economy, and it will have also an economic impact on growth in the European Union. So policymakers are going to be in high demand to come in the most cohesive, concerted, and hopefully positive way in response to the situation.
Yeah.
Final point, and I think this is something that does not apply only to the UK and the European Union and the euro area, is why, and I think those are the questions that will come to the fore, not just in the UK, but why is it that the populist voices, sometimes based on so-called truth that they now have to retract, why is it that those voices carried a lot more and a lot further than the voices of quote-unquote experts who were largely unanimous about the outcome and consequences of the decision? That's a big question to ask. Is it an issue of the economic outcome? Is it an issue of the democratic process? Is it an issue of the communication channels? But all those questions, I think, are on the table and warrant everybody's attention.
Well, there's another dimension to that. For those of you, and you're all junkies, so you all know this, who have studied how the vote went, millennials, by a large amount, voted to remain. And here's just a summary of a post that many of you probably have seen, which has gone viral, by somebody named Nicholas. He said the Brexit vote is 3 tragedies. First, the working classes who voted to leave will be hurt the most. Second, the younger generation will have never known the full extent of lost opportunities, and he says literally, freedom of movement was taken away by our parents, uncles, and grandparents in a blow to a generation already drowning in the debts of our predecessors. And his third point, which is searing, is that we now live in a post-factual democracy. That's exactly what you said, Christine. And he asks, when was the last time a prevailing culture of anti-intellectualism led to anything other than bigotry? So, after you've absorbed that, there's a lot of buyer's remorse out there. 3.5 million people have signed a petition to hold another referendum. Given the fact that the formal exit isn't triggered, do you think there's any chance that Can't You Take a Joke will be operative?
You know, it's really hard to speculate, but you know, the sleepy lawyer wakes up inside myself, and
I'm still asleep, my lawyer.
But I don't think that it's there. Although you could argue that with an advisory capacity and the sort of general uncertainty about the timeline, about the triggering point, about the 2 years time frame within which negotiations must be conducted, there is room for revision. But I just don't see it personally, and I certainly don't want to be quoted on that, because it's very much up in the air. And it's by the way, it's for the UK to actually decide for itself at the end of the day, and that country is the only country that can actually trigger the mechanism.
Right.
No matter how much the EU leaders insist on it being conducted very diligently, it is the UK that can trigger the Article 50.
Let me ask you about leadership in the context of Brexit. You've mentioned the need for a steady hand, but the World Post, which is part of the Huffington Post, something that I think is a very good piece of journalism, wrote yesterday that there are only 2 compelling leaders in the world: the Pope and Yo-Yo Ma. And I'm actually very partial to Yo-Yo Ma, since he was once the Harman Eisner Artist in Residence at the Aspen Institute and a dear friend. But who could lead Europe through this? What steady hand is in Europe? Angela Merkel comes to mind. So do you.
Angela Merkel comes to my mind, for sure. But you see, I think on this occasion, it's going to require concerted efforts on the part of many. And it's not going to be, and I don't think that it can ever be, just one single leader takes it all, drives it all. It's too multifaceted to be just the work of one single person. And whoever will be driving that bus will actually need to have all the passengers on board in order to move forward. Europe is an incredible construction, much criticized, much too slow, very laborious on occasions, but it's also an extraordinary achievement of the immediate aftermath of the Second World War, where countries had been at each other's throat and millions of people had died at the hands of each other for centuries. And to actually decide that in the name of peace and prosperity, they were going to establish that free market zone where product, services, and people can actually move is something that should not be wasted at all. And
right.
But it is a resilient construction and a resilient territory, which is unfinished and which needs to be completed. It's facing a lot of hardship, let's face it. If you combine the legacy of the financial crisis, which is still out there in some corners, you look at the terrorist attacks, which it has been the victim of in the last year and a half. If you look at the refugees inflow, which is arriving on the shores of many of the southern countries and moving up all the way to Sweden, and if you now take this first ever attempt to withdraw when the whole process was about integration, was about coming together. It's a lot to take for a construction that was not, inherited from the Westphalia Treaty, but something that was, only the Second World War construction. But it will take more than one person, but it will take certainly somebody who has the ability to bring together people with, for the moment, very different vested interests.
Well, you mentioned terrorism, and that's my last Brexit question. It occurs to me that, to quote Jerry Ford, we have to be able to walk and chew gum at the same time. And as people are preoccupied with this, as everyone should be, certainly in Europe, and I think no matter what Donald Trump says, I think this is a matter of great interest for the United States as well. There are prepositioned foreign fighters in Europe. And there is Vladimir Putin up north, who has already made excursions into Ukraine and is, at least many NATO countries fear what else he might do. While Europe is focused on this, would this be, unfortunately, a good opportunity for some of those folks who think attention is being paid elsewhere to conduct mischief?
I pray that this is not the case. I really do. I really do. Yeah. But, there's certainly a great level of integration at the economic level that needs to be perfected, that needs to be completed. I think that in terms of security, there has to be, further work and more in-depth work to be done within the European Union.
Well, Christine, turning to a few other subjects, and then we'll get to audience questions. You were recently in Japan for a meeting of the G7. Every time I check, because I do get these texts from you and invite you to dinner, you're in Kazakhstan or you're going to somewhere, but you have been focusing, I know, in addition to Kazakhstan, literally, on Ukraine, Iraq, Egypt. Endemic corruption is a huge concern of yours. Just a few words about other things you are doing or you will be doing while you are also in this position managing or helping to manage the Brexit crisis.
Thank you to ask me that question, because I have to look at the future and look at as positively as I can. In my first few years, I tried to shift a little bit, together with the management team, the IMF in the direction that was a bit unconventional and not especially orthodox. We have really focused on some alternative topics that are macro-critical all the same, but that include the likes of climate change, what do we do about it? Empowerment of women, what do we do about it? Financial inclusion, what do we do about it? Excessive inequality, what impact does it have on growth? And those are areas that I think actually matter enormously, not only for macroeconomic purposes, not only to have a good and solid set of fiscal principles, but also because they actually bring the level of, hopefully, more security, more inclusion, less inequality, that actually repair or support and strengthen the chemistry of societies. And this is particularly relevant at this point in time, because I think that some of the answers, some of the analysis in relation to these topics are critical for people. I don't think that we have communicated well enough or clearly enough, leaving aside the jargon that economists and others use, but I think that I would like to continue to push the institution in that direction. Our focus is economy, our focus is stability, and I think those are the basic principles upon which societies can actually prosper and be developed. But it can only be done on solid pillars, and with the principle of inclusion being first and foremost. And it's with that concern in mind that I believe that the work we have begun doing on corruption is very important. How much corruption represents in the world? Anywhere between 1.5 and $2 trillion. How many countries are concerned? Many. And not just the odd country down south in this sort of low-income development country. Who are the victims? Generally the most exposed people. Can it be fixed? Yes. Will it take time? Yes. Will it require cohesion and leadership? Yes, of course. Will the transition from an economic point of view need careful analysis and policy advice? Absolutely. You don't go from a nicely oiled system that is built on bribes and rigged procurement contracts to something that is transparent and where people are accountable without a degree of transition. So those are some of the areas that I would like to continue to push, along with exceptional quality of research and service to the membership.
My final question is, growing up in France, where you were a synchronized swimmer, and going to the United States for a year, I think, at Holton Arms, and being an intern for then Congressman Bill Cohen, then this school and teaching and this vaunted law career, did you ever imagine that you would be here now in your second term as the director of the IMF?
No. Absolutely not. Nor did I plan for that actually ever, but no.
Well, all I can say is, aren't we glad she's there? So questions, and one I would like to call on Kitty Boone, whether she wants to be called on or not. I hope she's here. She's there because Kitty has come up with, I think, a great idea about Greece, and I think you ought to put it to Christine.
I'll take any of those.
Okay,
No,
here's
not.
my idea, but I don't know how to turn it into a question. But maybe you can say, does this make sense? Is it possible? The Greek economy is a disaster. The debt now is a huge question. Rio, for the Olympic Games, is a disaster. The IOC, the way they make decisions, is really complicated. Could we please permanently install the Olympic Games in their home in Athens and give economy and tourism and strength and have one place that's environmentally safe? You don't have to build stadiums that have dust weeds right after the day, and help Greece and help the world find a place in Europe that is a legitimate home for the Olympic Games. That's my question.
You know, I think it's a great out-of-the-box idea. Thank you, Casey. Thank you. You know, to the extent that it's going to create demand, which is what this economy absolutely needs, it would be great. How you combine the sort of single location with the multilateral, multi-country, extraordinary sort of appeal that the Olympics can have to many countries around the world is something that needs to be thought through. How you could have a good governing body that would actually supervise, make sure that there is transparency, there is accountability, there is no, you know, funny business as occurred in the past in some places. I think that might, but it's a very interesting idea, and you're right. The marathon was run the first time ever in Greece, and the Olympic is only called the Olympic because of the the Olymp, which is actually sitting in Greece and which has hosted so many fantastic athletes, which was part of the mens sana in corpore sano principles that the Greeks very much had. Huh. Yeah.
So Kitty has the first big idea of the afternoon. Other questions? Right here. Is that Bob? Yes. Wait, hold on. He's right here.
Thank you for being...
Identify yourself.
Bob Abernathy. Thank you for being here with us. You said a minute ago that much work needs to be done in security in Europe. What would you set for an agenda for the meeting in Warsaw next month?
I'm totally out of my depth on that one. So I don't pretend to have any recommendations or any lessons to those who are in the know. But you know, when I was in November in Paris at the time of the attack on Bataclan, I walked the streets of Washington. Je suis Charlie, and all I can tell is that it's going to require concerted efforts and at all levels of our organizations, societies, and not just at the police and intelligence levels. I think people have to be adopting a different view about security themselves.
The meeting in Warsaw is a meeting of NATO members, for those who don't know. Questions over there on the aisle? I'm sure there's a microphone. I just know it. Here it is. Please identify yourself.
My name is Aaron Dujuchisom. I am Pearson Scholar. I'm originally from Nigeria. In January, you visited my home country, and you said you advised the Nigerian government to act with resolve, build resilience, and exercise restraint. These are your 3 words. And with Britain leaving the EU, as an emerging economy that solely depends on oil, and most of our stock is tied with pounds, tied with dollars, what advice do you have for an emerging economy such as Nigeria and other African countries who are battling with climate change, battling with migration crisis, and other things?
Good question.
Well, first of all, what I can tell you is that I was very, very pleased to see the exchange rate new policy that has been decided by the Central Bank of Nigeria. And I'm delighted that President Buhari has agreed to that change as being part of the overall Nigerian policy. I think it's a move in the right direction. Clearly, your country is a massive producer of oil. It's not the only, contrary to some other countries that I visited earlier, as you mentioned, Jane, it's a country that actually has other sources of growth that is far more diversified, but where resources are predominantly, particularly the revenue for the state of Nigeria, from oil. The fact that it's heading in the direction of a more flexible exchange rate, I think, is so wise and so much better than what there was before. So I think on that front, the country is heading in the right direction. Diversification of sources of growth is a critical one. And I think the fight against corruption is something that President Buhari himself, who was present at the London summit against corruption, has devoted his energy and efforts towards. And it needs to be continued. We need to support him and help him along the way. But fighting against corruption, diversifying the economy, making sure that there is growth in the country in order to create the jobs for the Nigerian population, particularly the young people, on the basis of a monetary policy and an exchange rate that is more variable than it was before, I think hopefully will position the country in a much better shape for the future. It's the largest economy and certainly largest population in Africa. The rebasing of the Nigerian economy has certainly demonstrated that, and I hope it heads in the right direction.
Over here, let's see. Elliot, front row.
I'd like to return to...
This is Elliot Gerson.
Elliot Gerson from the Aspen Institute. I'd like to return to Nicholas, the young man who wrote the letter in the Financial Times that Jane referenced that went viral. About 3/4 of Britons under 25 voted to remain. And they have the most at stake. Mm-hmm. Almost as many voted the other way who are retired and who have the least at stake. What specific message do you have for Nicholas and his young contemporaries who seem to be now in a state of national depression?
I think many of them went to vote, but many of them actually regret today that they have not for some reason. And clearly the future of their country is going to belong to them more than anybody else. And I hope that they can move in a positive direction. They can be hopefully guided. I say that with trepidation because I think that we are seeing massive changes. And the assumption that somebody is going to guide them is maybe very full of vanity in a way, because I think there is very much a desire of, I want to take my destiny in my own hands. I want to be able to communicate, and I don't really understand what those intermediaries, however democratically elected and representative they're supposed to be, are going to do with my future. So I think we need to ask the right questions, try to find together the right answers. I think for the next couple of years, it's going to be a difficult moment. That's the time it will take to conduct the negotiations and see under what terms the country withdraws, if it does, as presumably it will, and whether it will take the direction of Norway, which, as you know, has an economic arrangement which requires that, which authorizes them to actually transfer goods and services without restrictions, but also requires that they pay their contribution to the European Union and that they open their space to movement of people. That would be probably for those young people the most comforting outcome. I'm not sure that it will be perfectly satisfactory to those at the other end of the age spectrum, because you end up, as actually the authorities of Norway was telling me 10 days ago, with paying the bill, not having a say on the regulations, enforcing the regulations, and opening new territories. But a la Norway arrangement would be probably the best outcome, both in economic terms and in response to the concern of Nicholas and all his friends.
Anybody in the back? Then in the front, right here. Just wait for the mic and identify yourself, please.
Nancy Lazar. What policy advice would you give the leadership of Italy and Spain and maybe even France to reduce the odds of a referendum vote in those countries?
I would stick to my knittings, and I would say put in place the policies that will actually lift the economy, that will create demand, that will generate growth, that will create jobs, and that will, bring a bit of an uplifting sentiment around the country. Mm-hmm. I'm saying that I'm sticking to my knittings because I think that's a really important message. What have we had so far? We've had terrific monetary policy authorities. The central banks have carried the burden very much on their back, with little support on the part of fiscal, on the part of structural reforms. And I think that, if anything, that should be a strong wake-up call to those authorities to actually drive forward that agenda that we have called the three-pronged approach. Structural reforms, fiscal space used, please, and whatever fiscal policy you have in place, make sure that they're growth-friendly, and have the monetary policy in the background to continue to help and support, and that is perfectly legitimate, but it cannot be on its own. So that would be my strong recommendations. Turn your country and your economy towards positive, towards demand, towards growth, and make sure that instead of having 10-point-something unemployment rates in those territories, you move the needle in the right direction, you create hope, you generate confidence.
I can't help underscore positive and hope. Just imagine if the Remain campaign had been based on positive and hope, what the result might have been. Last question. Way in the back over there.
They're all saying goodbye.
Hello, my name is Ariadne Platero. I am a British citizen, both heartbroken and in mourning.
Did you vote?
I am not allowed to vote because I've lived in America for over 14 years, and they take away your vote when you've been expat for 14 years in the UK, though I would have clearly voted to remain. My question is, assuming the British government does withdraw from Europe, would you expect the European...
Assuming the British government
does withdraw, does trigger Article 50, do you expect the European Union to be very harsh, not to say punishing, in their negotiations as a way of dissuading other people in the domino effect that we've been hearing about? Or would you expect any form of compassion?
You know, I personally don't believe in the virtue of punishment in many instances. I think that encouraging, supporting people to head in the right direction is probably a lot better. Equally, you know, I recognize the dilemma that the European leadership has, being overly chaleureux, warm-hearted in those negotiations and discussions is certainly not going to help to deal with the risk that is out there, not only of reduced growth, but of potential fragmentation that would result from a contagion effect. So, you know, how they find the right equilibrium between being rigorous and being fair is something that I hope is best exemplified at this point in time by Chancellor Merkel, who has gone out, I think, saying there's no need to be nasty with the British. And I'm almost hesitant when I say the British, because when I see what Nicola Sturgeon from Scotland is saying, I'm concerned that we're not even talking about the British. We're talking about very much the English, the Welsh. Ireland is going to be also a big question mark going forward. But I hope that this equilibrium point is going to be sensible enough to not harm unnecessarily and try to get a revenge against the English and others, but also is not going to be encouraging for others to look for similar situations.
So on that note, this is Christine and Xavier's first visit to Aspen. Should we invite them back?
Thank you very much. I'm Walter Isaacson, and it's my pleasure to be among those welcoming you to the Aspen Ideas Festival of 2016. At the Ideas Festival, we like to talk about big ideas, and especially on a night like tonight, when there's so many big ideas to talk about. But as someone who has straddled the border between being a journalist and writing history, I know that when you're up close, it's often hard to see what the big ideas really are. I mean, back in 1968, when so much was happening with Martin Luther King and Bobby Kennedy and the '68 convention, Time magazine had to pick a person of the year, and it ended up picking the people who had circled the moon because they thought that would end up being the most important thing that happened that year. They were phenomenally wrong. Nobody noticed, but at exactly that time, in California, somebody had figured out how to etch a processing unit of a computer onto a chip of silicon. Somebody else was putting together networks that would internetwork the various packet switch networks, and that became the internet. And that combination in '68 of the internet and the microchip, the microprocessor, ended up really affecting the world a lot more, and nobody saw it. When this institution was founded in 1949, it was a similar moment. On this very spot, in a tent almost like this, probably not as colorful, Albert Schweitzer kicked off the Aspen Institute. He did so as a global citizen who cared very much about global health. And at that moment, an era of globalization was being born. There was the Bretton Woods agreements that created things like the International Monetary Fund, the World Bank, the general agreements on tariffs and trade that have become things like the WTO. There was NATO that was invented that year and which helped take defense away from being a national thing to being a multinational project. Globalization included the Marshall Plan that led to the Schuman Plan for France and Germany to become an economic union, and eventually the EEC and the European Union. So that was the birth of globalization almost 70 years ago. And the age of globalization worked well for almost those 70 years. But the big idea we're facing today and this year, as we just heard, is that this is the end of the age of globalization. We've seen the spasms that came out of Brexit, but we're also seeing it from Stettin in the Baltics all the way to Manchester, England, and Manchester, New Hampshire. We're seeing the rise of nationalism and nativism in places like Hungary, Austria, even France, Germany, and even the United States. And the pillars of the age of globalization were threefold: a belief in free markets that included free trade, of the free movement of goods and services, immigration, and an optimistic view of technology. All of those pillars have now been shaken. And we have the rise of nativism, we have the rise of nationalism, and we sometimes blame it on bad political systems or whatever. But I think the problem went even deeper. And the big idea here is that we have to figure out how, at the end of the age of globalization, we're going to bring back some of those values that started 70 years ago. And those values really depend on understanding that the prosperity that came from an age of globalization has to be shared equally and equitably. That's what Christine Lagarde said just a few moments ago, that we have to have an inclusive form of capitalism. Because even if all of the tenets of free movement of goods and services and free trades and free minds, all of the tenets of globalization end up creating more global wealth, we've just noticed that it doesn't sustain itself if people feel that they were left out. And whether it's a shipbuilder in Sherburne who no longer has a shipyard to go to, or the Maytag plant worker in Keokuk, Iowa, who no longer has a Maytag plant to go to, these are the people who are rejecting this era of globalization. And we have to realize that it wasn't just bad news or bad journalism or people who don't like facts that did it. It was actually real. That this era of globalization increased inequality and gutted a working middle class across Europe and across the United States. So if we are going to try to restore the notion of the values there, we have to dedicate ourselves to the type of globalization in which everybody gets to participate. Instead of having the rewards of a global economy go to the top 1%, we have to use it to rebuild infrastructure. Rebuild infrastructure so that we'd have great rail systems, great investments in our air traffic, great investments in our ports, so that we would have a return on that investment, but also so that people would be put back to work. We have to look at the lens of putting people back to work. We have to do things like use the proceeds of a great global economy to build a world-class K-12 education system again. The United States used to have the best. Now we've let it drop to 17th best because we didn't invest the proceeds of a global economy into it. Worse yet, that K-12 system split so that people in this room and people who were beneficiaries of the global economy, they got to send their kids to good schools, was a person in Keokuk who no longer had the job at the Maytag plant or in the inner city. They at best got mediocre or poor schools. So the big idea for me is that we have to have a rebirth of a belief in free markets, free minds, free trade. But we have to do it by making sure that every day we think, how is that going to help somebody get a good job at good wages and feel they're a part of this new economy? Thank you. Thanks, Michael. Thank you. It is now, as it has been for 40 years or so, my great pleasure to introduce my friend, our partner, David Bradley, the proprietor of Atlantic Media Company.
Good afternoon. I'm David Bradley. I'm the owner of The Atlantic. On behalf of our editors and our writers, I join Walter in saying that we really welcome you to the Ideas Festival. With the privilege of having Christine Lagarde and Susan Rice with us, we are trying to shorten our opening remarks this year. So forgive me for reading. To a degree I've not seen before, Walter and I are tightly scripted. My role is to read a few administrative announcements, and I'm to stay on script. But doesn't that feel wrong? That's not how you honor friendship. By now, aren't we friends? How many of you have been here for the opening sessions before? Oh, so it's friends. And the right way for me to honor you as friends is to just take my time and open up and tell you about myself and my last year. Thank you so much for asking. I'm just freighted with insecurity when I stand up here each year thinking about never becoming the cunning businessman that I intended. I have you here. I have Red Mountain behind me. 16 years ago, I bought The Atlantic from Mort Zuckerman for $11.5 million. In an unrelated transaction, Mort bought a residence on Red Mountain for $11.5 million. So now, Mort owns a piece of Aspen real estate, and I own a mid-19th century long-form literary print magazine. And I just worry, maybe he got the best. Maybe he's up there now, looking at the tent, saying to himself, you know, I bet David would buy some London real estate. Anyway, I'll go back to script. Let me just do, we've got 5 announcements. I'm reluctant to begin with an indelicate matter, but since we met last April, Aspen has gotten caught up in the whole transgender bathroom issue. The City Council in Aspen has voted an ordinance which requires public facilities to offer the option of a transgender facility. Meanwhile, the voters of Colorado have passed a referendum that goes the other direction that says bathrooms shall be for the gender of your birth. And then the Superior Court of Colorado put a temporary stay on the referendum, and the governor tried to win. In any event, and I'm really sorry to tell this to you, but for those of you here, for the time that you are in Colorado, we need to ask all of you to refrain from going to the bathroom. If this presents a hardship for you, there's an exception to the rule for private residents, of course. I only know the address of one private residence. It's back here in Red Mountain. So if any of you would like that address, I'd be happy to share it, and I'm sure he would be happy to see you at his door and welcome you to use his bathroom. I have another indelicate topic. May I ask how many of you have been impregnated in Brazil or by a Brazilian man in the last 3 months? For reasons of epidemiology, we are going to need to put you in a special Brazil section at all of our programs. For those of you who would like to be impregnated by a Brazilian man, there's a gentleman here in the front row with a clipboard. He's doing a sign-up. He'd love to see you. Third announcement, for the first time, we are experimenting with driverless cars here on campus. Google has provided what are called bubble cars. These are small vehicles which have sealed windows, and they go from building to building. We began the experiment yesterday with our speakers. Unfortunately, the cars have picked up the speakers, but in a software glitch have not yet discharged the speakers. We have about 20 speakers motoring silently around campus. So if you happen to see Francis Fukuyama or Madeleine Albright, you might mouth some words of encouragement. There's one piece of bad news, I'm afraid. For reasons of economics, we are having to adjust the festival pricing. We've been able to keep the price for the passes the same, but we're going to have to charge for the amenities. So I noticed that many of you, when you arrived in the tent this afternoon, were not carrying your luggage. Presumably you left it, checked it at the hotel or whatever. Beginning tomorrow, there is going to be a surcharge of $20 per bag per day for a piece of luggage that you left at the hotel. For those of you who would like to economize, we recommend that you bring your luggage with you to these sessions. You're welcome to bring up to 2 bags without charge. And if you need a skycap or someone to help you, we have arranged for a team of New Yorker writers to carry your baggage. We suggest you pay them at the rate of $1 per article of clothing. They are used to being paid on a per-word basis. To close, I have a piece of happy news. Finally, happy news for the Hotel Jerome. The Jerome has been chosen for one of those national top 10 lists. It is the 8th most haunted place in the United States. And the problem for the Jerome is ghosts, many ghosts, and I want to tell you about just one ghost. This is the ghost of Katie Kerrigan. So back in the 1890s, the hotel employed a 16-year-old chambermaid, uncommonly beautiful. She was so beautiful that though she was the favorite of the guests, she created great envy among the other chambermaids. So one day in the winter of 1892, one of those chambermaids told Katie that her beloved kitten had gotten outside, had gone out onto the ice in a pond, and had fallen into the water. God had bestowed many gifts on Katie so that you can forgive him for forgetting intelligence. Katie went running out onto the ice and fell in. She was rescued, but she died of pneumonia 7 days later. So that's the historical fact that's in the record. Now, the ghost of Katie, scores of guests at the hotel have said over the years that they have seen Katie Kerrigan cleaning rooms on the 3rd floor. Maids talk about going into rooms that needed cleaning and finding that the linen had been changed or the turn-down service had already been done. There are maids to this day who will not work on the 3rd floor. What is sad, of course, is it's been 100 years. It's been 100 years, and Katie Kerrigan is still doing the same entry-level work she did when she arrived at the hotel. Katie is old. She's very old. She's white. She's non-college educated. She has been squeezed out of the American dream. She is the archetypal Tea Party member. So when those of you who are liberal look at each other Trump, that is because they are ghosts, like Katie Kerrigan. I have a closing privilege here each time, which is to just tell you my high regard for Walter Isaacson. He is the greatest best-selling biographer in the world. He is a member or a fellow or an honoree of the Royal Society of the Arts, the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, the American Philosophical Society, the National Endowment for the Humanities. He is the president and CEO here, but he is also the originator. He is the idea creator for the Ideas Festival. So the week ahead is a Walter Isaacson creation. Thank you very much, Walter Isaacson. So we need to change the set, and I need to change my role. It's my privilege to welcome the President's National Security Advisor, Ambassador Susan Rice, and we'll do a conversation up here. So welcome, Susan. You know Aspen, and Aspen surely knows Susan. Susan is here with her family. Her husband, Ian Cameron, is a network news producer. She has her 2 children here. Jake just graduated high school and is off to Stanford. And Maris is in her early teens and is in school in Washington, D.C. We're very happy to have them here, but it does undo my opening questions, which were going to be, whom did you date before Ian? And could you describe that first kiss? We'll forego those. So let's do a couple topics on the news. And then what I'd love to do is go backwards and do a more reflective conversation. As National Security Advisor, you are in charge of coordinating economic, political, security matters. Brexit hits Thursday night, Friday morning. I assume the US government scrambles or gets on it. Could you do a behind-the-scenes story? What happened? What hour did you find out? And then what did you begin to do?
Well, obviously, in the first instance, David, we anticipated that we needed to be prepared for either scenario, and we were. We had already on the economic team coordinated with our G7 partners and others in advance in anticipation, particularly of the leave outcome, not because we thought that was the likely outcome, but because that was the more consequential outcome. And so Secretary of Treasury Jack Lew, working with the National Economic Council and the National Security Council teams, had in place a series of contingencies related to the leave scenario. On the national security side, similarly, we planned both our public statements that would come for either scenario. We had a plan for the president to speak as soon as reasonably possible to Prime Minister Cameron. He also spoke very closely in the same window to Chancellor Merkel. And so we had a series of plans in place.
There's a protocol in place for this.
That would have applied to either scenario. As it turned out, this all occurred on Thursday as the president was in California, in Silicon Valley, for the Global Entrepreneurship Summit. And as we were on the plane and then arriving, the results were beginning to come in. And you will recall that during the day on Thursday, initially there was some degree of optimism that the Remain outcome would prevail. But as the hours went by, it became increasingly clear that that would not be the case. And so we operated on the basis of the plan for the leave scenario. The president reached out to try to get to Prime Minister Cameron that evening, but given the time difference and it was quite late in the UK, it wasn't until the next morning that they actually connected.
So what would he say to the Prime Minister? He gets him on the phone. It is the largest fact in Britain of recent, the largest fact in Cameron's career.
Bummer.
Bummer. We made news.
No, obviously, I mean, this is something they talked about in many different contexts. And when the president was in the UK in April, they both had the opportunity to speak to the issue publicly. So there was, they'd had also spent time together just a couple weeks prior at the G7 and with Christine and others. And so they had, talked through this potential outcome as well as the preferable outcome of the Remain scenario. Obviously, the president has worked very, very closely with Prime Minister Cameron over the years. And so in addition to a discussion about the consequences of the vote and conveying our respect for the will of the British people, it was also an opportunity for the president to underscore how much he appreciated David Cameron as a partner and as a friend. They will have time together for the next few months. They'll see each other within the next couple of weeks at the Warsaw Summit, the NATO Summit. But obviously, it's a painful occasion when a partner that close experiences a loss that profound.
The lead editorial, at least online, in the New York Times today was the security implications of Brexit. I didn't find it very compelling. Are there a lot of security implications? What are you worried about?
Well, I think, to be very candid, there's a lot we don't know. I think in the most fundamental sense, the United States and the United Kingdom are going to remain the closest of partners and allies. The much touted special relationship will endure as it has through many, many different challenges and periods of ups and downs. Britain is a core member of NATO, and so the security architecture that binds us, along with our European allies, 22 of the European Union members are also members of NATO. And so all of that remains very much the same, and arguably will be strengthened as a result of this, because the need to stay lashed up will be even greater. Britain plays a critical role in the counter-ISIL campaign and in many of our collective efforts related to security around the world. So that will all remain the same. So I think the immediate security implications are probably relatively few. And certainly we will do all we can to ensure that the areas in which we're cooperating, counterterrorism, you name it, remain solid.
Let's do one other issue in the news. Let's do Orlando, the Pulse nightclub. It was exactly 2 weeks ago today. And do you know the term TikTok?
Yes.
We use in journalism. I'd love to hear the TikTok of how something like this happens. The shooting took place at 1:58 a.m. The police were notified at 2:06 a.m. Can you tell us about how does the message come into the White House? Who receives it? When do you get it? When does the president get it? And then as to this issue, is this just a police matter, or do you find yourself rallying something?
Well, as for the TikTok, David, in this case, obviously it happened in the wee hours of the night. There was a fair bit of confusion and ambiguity as to the nature of what was going on for several hours, from about 2 to 5.
Do you get awakened for all these events?
Typically, yes, and in this case, yes.
Yeah.
And so too would Lisa Monaco, the president's counterterrorism czar, whom you know well. She would be the principal person in that circumstance, a case of what appeared to be and that turned out to be home-based terrorism, to gather the information and provide the first briefing to the president. And
when does that take place?
Well, it depends when it happens. In this instance, it was very early morning.
Yeah.
And then in the hours as we were getting more information, as you recall, tragically the numbers of dead jumped dramatically. We all came into the White House on that Sunday morning, and we were there briefing the president. We had FBI Director Comey as well. And then the president, of course, went out and made a statement to the nation that was carefully crafted in light of what we knew and didn't know at that moment. And then the work obviously continues in the days and weeks that follow, and it still remains something of great significance.
I guess this is hard to predict, but it feels like lone wolves could be with us for a while. Do you have a sense, long after you're here in office, is this a new normal we should expect to be handling, or are there ways that we can get on top of this?
Well, I think that, first of all, we do have to recognize that whether it's terrorism related and motivated by extremists from the outside, or views that may be of an individual nature that motivate an individual to pick up a gun and go and commit a tragedy of significance and importance, we're going to face this for some time to come. And I think any responsible policymaker or leader would acknowledge that. But what we are doing and what we must do is to take the fight to the maximum extent that we can to the terrorists abroad. And that's what we're doing in the context of the counter-ISIL campaign in Iraq and Syria, but frankly, not just in Iraq and Syria. We're working in places as far-ranging as Libya to Afghanistan to deal with the ISIL threat, as well as the remnants of al-Qaeda that persist, particularly in places like Yemen. So this is a challenge that the United States and the world is going to face for years to come. But we've made some very substantial progress in recent months in the campaign against ISIL, particularly in Iraq, where now about 45% of the territory that ISIL had taken and held in 2014 has been taken back by the coalition, by the Iraqi security forces. A number of the ISIL leaders have been taken off the battlefield. Their financial resources have been diminished quite substantially. by going after their oil infrastructure and their banking facilities. The number of foreign fighters flowing into Syria and Iraq is for the first time diminishing. Still significant, but the aggregate numbers are down.
Give us some numbers on that.
Well, the high-end number some months ago or a year ago reached as high of an estimate of 30,000. It's now the high end of it, and it's a range, of course, is about 22,000. So it's not insignificant, the reduction. But this is a function of the fact that we've got 66 countries that are part of this coalition and who are becoming more adept at monitoring who's traveling from their countries, who's returning from their countries. They're doing a better job of sharing information on travelers and passengers. And countries like Turkey, which had been for quite some while a very porous border for ISIL to penetrate, have cracked down, and now it's quite a bit harder to get into Syria through Turkey than it was, say, a year ago. So all of this is combined to make a difference.
I know we worry about the diaspora of ISIS, but if you had to think through kind of a range of time here, when do you think ISIS may no longer control land in Iraq and Syria? When could that be done?
Well, I don't know that one can make a prediction with any certainty, and I've been around long enough not to try. But I think if you look at the progress that's been made, as I said, almost 45 to 50% over predominantly the last 12 to 18 months in Iraq. 20% of the territory that had been held by ISIL that's populated has been taken back in Syria. So if that rate can be sustained, and people can draw their own conclusions. But I think, frankly, the bigger challenge is not just territory in terms of size and space, but critical pieces of territory. So, for example, the Iraqi security forces making progress in taking back Fallujah is quite significant. In Syria, the forces that we support, the Syrian Arab forces, are encircling a town called Manbij in northern Syria, which is strategically very significant and is a milestone on the road to Raqqa, which is obviously the ISIL capital in Syria. And so we have, the focus, frankly, is on Raqqa, ultimately in Syria, and on Mosul, ultimately in Iraq.
Let me shift gears and shift decades by just a little bit. Let me take you way back. So Susan was born in 1964, is a Washingtonian. She calls herself a DC girl through and through. Who were your parents, Susan?
My father was Emmett Rice. He's passed away. He was born and raised in segregated South Carolina. He was a Tuskegee Airman during World War II. He got his PhD in economics after the war at UC Berkeley. His first job was as an assistant professor of economics at Cornell, where he was the first African-American professor. And his career spanned academia, the development world. He was at the Treasury Department and the World Bank for many years, private banking. And he retired as a governor of the Federal Reserve System, appointed by President Carter. So my dad, who's been gone now 5 years, was a tremendous influence in my life and a wonderful man. My mom, thankfully, is still alive, Lois Rice, but in fragile health. She was born and raised in Portland, Maine, which was a rarity, the daughter of immigrants from Jamaica. And my grandparents, my maternal grandparents, having emigrated from Jamaica in 1912, had very little education. My grandfather was a janitor. My grandmother was a maid and a seamstress. And yet they cobbled together the resources and got financial aid and sent my mother's 4 older brothers to college at Bowdoin. And my grandparents were the first parents ever to have 4 sons graduate from Bowdoin. And so to honor that, they made my grandfather an honorary member of what would have been his graduating class of 1912.
It's amazing.
My mom couldn't go to Bowdoin because she was a girl, so she unfortunately had to go to Radcliffe instead.
Everybody's fallback.
She made her career primarily in education policy. She's sometimes known as the mother of the Pell Grant because she worked very actively to bring that into fruition from various perches, particularly when she served at the College Board. She's now still nominally a fellow at the Brookings Institution, where occasionally she still goes into work, and her most recent work has been on trying to bring diversity to the think tank community, which is about as hard as bringing diversity to the national security workforce.
So I assume it wasn't an everyday household. What was distinctive about them in the way that they produced these children?
Well, we grew up in a very engaged household where the dinner table conversation was about the events of the day. I would get yelled at, or my younger brother would get yelled at if we did something that prevented my father from catching the lead story on the nightly news. That was about as big a sin as we could commit growing up. And we watched the nightly news back in the day when there were 3 networks, and Walter Cronkite and Vietnam War, and that is
Atlantic.
the environment. That's the environment that we grew up in. And my parents went out of their way to make sure we knew what was going on. I have vivid memories at 3 and 4 years old of going down to see Washington after the riots and visiting Resurrection City and being made to watch Bobby Kennedy's casket come back across the country and learning about Martin Luther King's assassination. And all of this was very real and very tangible and part of our day-to-day
I've read that
home training.
that they taught you about race. What was that teaching?
Well, it was different. My father, having grown up in the segregated South and serving in a segregated Air Force, and being also about 15 years older than my mom, had a different perspective than my mom growing up in Portland, Maine, as the daughter of immigrants. My father's view was, well, actually, it's interesting. They came from different orientations, but their basic message and teaching to us was very much the same, which is you have to do your best. If you do your best, that will be good enough, but don't ever let race be an excuse or a crutch. You just have to be who you are and do your best, and your best will be good enough. Now, my father, interestingly, felt, even having had extraordinary success in his career, some lingering degree of resentment about the concept of having had to serve in a segregated army. Mm-hmm. If you're good enough to put your life on the line for your country, his view was you should be treated as an equal citizen. And for much of his life,
that stayed with him.
He wasn't. It stayed with him, but not in a sense of causing him to be bitter, but motivating him to prove all of those concepts wrong. His focus was on demonstrating the folly of segregation and the ignorance of racism.
The decades go by. Do you find yourself teaching your children about race in any particular way, and is it the same teaching that your parents taught?
I've tried, but so much has changed. My children are interracial children, and they have experienced racism in a very different way than their grandparents did, or even than I did. And they've grown up in a world where race is hardly the defining factor for them or for their peers, which is tremendous progress. They, spent 8 years living under the first African American president. They live in a world where neither race nor sexual orientation nor any of the so-called definitions that we impose on one another have the same import or meaning to them. So sometimes when I try to explain stuff to them and make sure that they're understanding history or understanding why a particular point is important for me to impart to them, they get a little bit impatient with me and say, come on, Mom. It's like, you know, why is that important? Now they're here, they could probably speak for themselves, and I don't encourage that.
We've set aside 45 minutes for the next session with your children. So my favorite recruiting question is, who were you in high school? Because often who you become is beginning to come out there. You were at National Cathedral School, so who were you in high school? Who was your crowd? What were you like?
You want me to tell the truth? I was the ostensibly very well-behaved, very successful child who never got caught.
Let's go with this ostensibly.
I was...
were you a model for the...
Okay, so objectively, I was valedictorian. I was school government president. I played varsity basketball and tennis.
Were there any other students in the school?
There were a few. I had an active social life, but I worked really hard, and I had a lot of fun, and I didn't do everything right, but I didn't get caught.
What would your peers say about you if they said, well, hey, what was Susan like in high school? What was her wiring? What was distinctive about Susan? Could we already see the discipline and the ambition and the striving, or is that a later thing?
I think you probably could have seen it.
You could have seen it, might have spotted it. Yeah.
Might have, maybe.
Yeah. So, I don't want to put you on the defensive as we exit the personal side, but this is probably a good time to explain the story about the birthday cake in the backseat of the car.
Oh, come on. Here we go. This is my brother's revenge. Did you get this from James, or did you do this on your own?
This is my own reading.
Research? Okay. You want me to explain it?
Please.
Okay, so...
It's not obvious, right?
This is sort of, one of the less proud moments of my childhood in retrospect. My younger brother, John, is 2 years younger than I am. And we were quite close. We are quite close. But we also were known to fight on occasion. And he would probably argue that we still do. And on his birthday, I think it was roughly his 7th birthday. Sixth. I was, I guess the only way to put this is pissed off that it was his birthday and not mine. And so, because it was his birthday, he got to ride in the front seat of the car. I was in the back seat of the car with his birthday cake. And somehow, between when the birthday cake was loaded into the car and when we got back home to celebrate the birthday, somebody sat on the box.
This is going to be uncomfortable for you, but it is the same dress. Would you stand and turn around? So you're going to be too modest to do what I'm about to do. Stanford, Rhodes Scholar, DPhil at Oxford, McKinsey, joined the Clinton administration on the National Security Council staff, Assistant Secretary for African Affairs at age 32, the youngest Assistant Secretary at State in history. Then left the administration, as you're required to do when the administration is over, and went into those outlaw years. And I'm going to take you to modern history. So it's 2006, and you meet with Senator Obama, who's just revving up his senatorial campaign. You have I assume you knew the Clintons, but you were taken by President Obama. Give us a little bit of that chapter. How did you come to decide, let me commit here?
Well, first of all, I was very privileged to serve 8 years under President Clinton. First at the National Security Council as a director and then senior director. And then I went over to state and was the Assistant Secretary for Africa. And I worked very closely with President Clinton, particularly during my time at the White House, but also at state, and with Secretary Clinton, who, back as First Lady, took quite an interest in Africa and traveled to Africa. I traveled with her when she went. And so I knew them, liked them, respected them, and obviously still do.
This is hard.
Yes, it was. So let me just give you the history. I met President Obama for the first time in 2004 when he was running for Senate. And I was a senior foreign policy advisor on the John Kerry campaign. It was in that context as he was trying to stay coordinated with the Kerry campaign on major foreign policy issues that I first met him. I got to know him better when he came to Washington, having been elected to the Senate. And it was while he was in his early days on the Senate Foreign Relations Committee that he reached out to me and others for bouncing ideas off of us on particular issues from nonproliferation to development that were germane to his work on the Foreign Relations Committee. And so from more or less 2004 through 2006, I worked informally but pretty intensively with then Senator Obama. When Senator Obama decided to run for president, he asked me and former National Security Advisor Tony Lake to co-coordinate his national security and foreign policy apparatus and to bring in experts from various different fields of national security and foreign policy. So it was that point that I had to make a decision. And frankly, I made a decision to support President Obama, not because I had any issue with the Clintons, quite the contrary. I had felt great gratitude to them for the experience that I had, and also enormous respect for what President Clinton had done as president. So it was a hard choice, but in some ways it wasn't that hard, because for me, President Obama represented a great deal of what I believed. We were...
If you will, do the human moment, Susan. I assume you call President Clinton or Mrs. Clinton. I've not been in politics. Is that an easy thing, or is that a hard human thing? Is there scar tissue? What happens? What did you do? Did you do a phone call?
No. So it's interesting history and context. I haven't thought about this in a while. So when I was at Senator Obama to work on his campaign, that was frankly before Secretary Clinton had started to put together any kind of national security and foreign policy team. I did get a call from my friend and former colleague Sandy Berger, who sadly recently passed. And Sandy was and remained a very close friend, and he called me saying, we haven't set anything up yet, but if we do, would you be interested in joining? And I said to Sandy, well, I might in a different context, but I feel compelled to work with President Obama.
Already. Yeah.
And he was understanding of that. And for me, as I was starting to say, the connection was one of experience. It was generational. It was multifaceted.
And it wasn't hard in the moment.
It wasn't hard. For me, it was the right choice. And I can't speak, for how it was received on the other side. All I can say is that I then subsequently had the privilege of working very closely with Secretary Clinton when I was UN ambassador. And we were colleagues at the principals table, but she was also, in many ways, my boss. And so whatever scratchiness my choice may or may not have caused, in her view, she was extremely supportive and professional and collaborative from day one through the time that we stopped working together, and she's been wonderful ever since.
Susan, let's do a few minutes on public policy. Your current chapter comes to an end in another 6.5 months. You will have been in government for 8 years. You can't be the same person you were when you entered. Presumably your views evolve as you have to do the job. So I want to do just a little bit of the education of Susan Rice. And I want to do the issue that you've cared about so much, genocide. I'm going to lay the groundwork here. So Susan was in the Clinton administration when Rwanda took place and was part of the group that rethought, gee, did we do enough there? So when she was UN ambassador, she took the lead on taking the UN Security Council to Darfur and getting through a resolution there, leading the UN Security Council to a vote on Gaddafi and stopping genocide, his attack on civilians there. Do Rwanda for a moment. You visited it in 1994, 4 months after it. What did you see and what were your thoughts?
Well, David, this occurred when I was in my first job in government at the National Security Council staff. I was the director responsible for UN issues and peacekeeping. I wasn't at that time working on Africa. So I was looking at it from the vantage point of the UN, of the peacekeeping mission that was there that had so many failures and frustrations. And my first visit to Rwanda came in December, so it was 7 months really after the genocide, 7-8 months after the genocide. And I accompanied the National Security Advisor, then Tony Lake, on this trip to Rwanda and several other countries. And 8 months may seem like a long time, but what was so profoundly disturbing about that trip was that the genocide was still on full display.
The bodies
were still everywhere. And we visited a churchyard, which had a school right next to it. And all through the church, and all through the yard, and all through the school, there were still bodies decomposing. And we couldn't walk through that site without stepping over and around these bodies. And I couldn't speak for some hours after that. And frankly, I don't think I've ever personally seen something more horrific before or since.
7 years later, you told The Atlantic, I'm going to quote here, there was a huge disconnect between the logic of the decisions we took along the way during the genocide and the moral consequence of the decisions taken collectively. I swore to myself that I ever faced such a crisis again, I would come down on the side of dramatic action, going down in flames if that was required. So this is the center of Susan Rice. And then we hit Syria. And there are 500,000 people who have died, 1.9 million wounded, 11 million in a country of 23 million who've been displaced. And I know every aching cell in you wanted to do something. What did you learn here? Is there nothing we can do on a humanitarian basis for those people?
Well, first of all, I wouldn't say there is, I would say we're doing a lot more than nothing, but let me describe what I think is an interesting difference. In the months between April 7th, when the genocide began in Rwanda, 1994, and when it ended some 3 months later, there was never a policy discussion about whether or not the United States should, or any other country for that matter, should intervene to stop the genocide. There were not editorials being written recommending that. There were not debates in Congress suggesting that the United States or the United States rallying others should intervene. There was nothing until it was over, and then there were issues of what do we do about the peacekeeping force? Do we support the French going in to enable the Hutu army to leave, etc. So what was so striking about that was that it didn't register sufficiently for those questions even to be asked. And there are many reasons for that. I think if people have a good historical memory, they'll recall that on March 31st, 7 days before the genocide, the last American troops pulled out of Somalia, following the Black Hawk Down experience that had happened 6 months prior. So America was focused in the first instance on ending what had been a painful and tragic experience of humanitarian intervention.
If you don't, do Syria for a moment, if you
I will. But the contrast is from the beginning of Syria, which, as you recall, began, like many of the other Arab Spring experiences, as in the first instance, a popular uprising, which had been preceded by Libya and others where we did intervene. The debate was, in the first instance, about how do we support the popular uprising, consistent with what we had done in other parts of the Arab uprising. Then how do we end the civil war? And then in the context of the Civil War, with its atrocities and its humanitarian consequences, what do we do? And we have wrestled, if not weekly, almost, sometimes daily, with the what do we do question. And so what have we done? Well, in the first instance, we have tried very hard to broker an end to the conflict, which we continue to believe can only happen through a diplomatic solution. We are the largest provider of humanitarian support and assistance to the Syrian people, having contributed almost now $5 billion over this period. So without that, the suffering would be much greater. We have intervened with partners to try to deal with ISIL, which is itself a perpetrator of genocide. In Iraq, we intervened on Sinjar Mountain in August of 2014 to literally save the Yazidi people who were trapped on that mountain at an imminent risk of facing genocide. And we succeeded in that. But we have not injected the United States directly in the war, the civil war, to topple Assad. We've done a lot of other things in support of the opposition and the like, but our judgment has been, and the president's judgment has been, that as horrific as what is happening in Syria is, it would be a greater mistake that would do greater damage to our interests for the United States to have intervened militarily in the civil conflict to topple Assad.
And is this the wiser Susan now? Would she tell the younger Susan, hey, handling genocide turns out to be a lot more difficult than we thought?
Well, first of all, let's distinguish between genocide and mass atrocities, which is, I think, an important distinction. And thankfully, we have not seen a genocide on the scale of something like Rwanda or Darfur in recent years. And Darfur was not on the scale of Rwanda. But what we have seen is a horrific civil war with tremendous mass atrocities and enormous displacement. So what would I say? I would say something very similar to what the president said when he explained to the American people the decision to go into Libya. And he said then, and it's what I believe, just because we can't intervene everywhere doesn't mean we shouldn't intervene anywhere. And so, frankly, we have to look at each of these instances case by case. I believe we have a special and higher obligation when the crimes rise to the level of genocide. But even in the context of genocide, it may not be possible to, or it may not be wise to intervene in every instance. But what I have learned, if nothing else, is we have to have the discussion and the debate. It has to be something that is on the agenda of the cabinet-level policy committee that I now chair in my current role. We can't do what we did in 1994, which is to not even feel the need to have the discussion or the debate and not have Congress and the press or anybody else call the question.
Two personal short answer questions, if I may, to wrap us up. The first is, all of us have good times and bad times, but when you're in public life, the bad times are so public. You've had good hours, bad hours. In the bad hour, what did you learn? Is Washington rougher than you thought? What did you learn about your own toughness? Just do a moment of personal learning.
I was reminded of what I've always known, but that thankfully I've never forgotten, which is that family and friends are what matter most. And I have always felt the strength to deal with the tough times because I've had the extraordinary backstopping of my parents, my husband, my kids, and some extraordinary friends that I have had from my earliest days to the present. And, you know, it's never fun to be the target. And I hope for many who have the privilege and the joy of being a public servant, and it is a privilege and it is a joy, that, you know, they don't have those extreme moments of being in the barrel. But even when that is the case, none of us, I think, serve in government at senior levels without recognizing the risk of that. And accepting that risk because we believe in the value of serving. And so I don't regret making the choices I've made. I don't regret assuming the risks of service.
Closing question, if I may. We all recognize that Ian's got a very taxing job as a network producer, and though from the outside yours looks like a cushier job, I'm sure it's got its own pressures. So is Anne-Marie Slaughter right that a woman can't have it all? Are there trade-offs? Or how have you dealt with that issue?
Okay, well, first of all, the one set of facts that you've gotten wrong in your excellent preparation is that my husband is no longer a network producer. He retired from ABC what year, honey? 2011. So when I was at the UN, my family stayed in Washington. He was an executive producer at ABC News. I was, you know, working during the week in New York and when possible trying to get home on the weekends to be with my family. And he was an executive producer of a Sunday show, which meant that our schedules were absolutely opposite. So when I came back home for the weekend was when he was working hardest. And so for a variety of reasons that aren't entirely due to my crazy job, but also somewhat due to his views of where network television has evolved to, he decided to stop working in network television and to be the principal parent. And he's stayed very busy doing a bunch of nonprofit work. But that was a choice that he made and that we made together. And it made my work at the UN and subsequently my work as National Security Advisor. So so I really do have the greatest husband in the world. And
so now
but so to Anne-Marie's point, I have a very strong view on this topic, which is women should just shut up and let everybody live their own lives and not tell anybody else how to do it. Because everybody's experience is different. And whether you lean in or lean out or stay at home or you know, give up your career and come back to it, that is, in my view, the most personal of decisions, and there's no cookie cutter answer to this. Everybody's got their own circumstances, their own husband or partner or no partner, kids or no kids, sick, healthy, and we just have to respect each other's choices. There are no wrong choices in this enterprise.
And now that Ian has stepped out of media, do you think
be gullible enough to do that? Thank you. That was fun.
It was fun. Moment. One moment. Can I get your attention for a moment? May I get everyone for just a second? Do you remember our tradition of a few people doing 3 minutes, here's my big idea? We have just a handful of them, including Senator Cory Booker. It's a superior into the program, so if you would bear with us, we have our first big idea. Good one.
My name is Priya Natarajan. I'm an astrophysicist and on the faculty at Yale. In one of my favorite books, louder? Okay. My name is Priya Natarajan. I'm an astrophysicist and on the faculty at Yale. In one of my favorite books, Alice in Wonderland, when Alice says that she can't believe in impossible things, the Queen responds, I dare say that you've not had much practice. My big idea is to challenge you all to open your minds, to examine a cherished belief, and evaluate if it needs a makeover, just once a month. Unlike the White Queen, who does it 6 times before breakfast, I would like to invite you to make it a habit to believe in impossible things. We've made tremendous progress in science and technology by refusing to rest on what we already believe, to allow ourselves to be led by our curiosity, to adapt and change, and be open to even altering our mental frame. Looking back, we see that even the greatest scientific minds, like Einstein, whose radical ideas reshaped our conception of the cosmos, struggled with changing his beliefs. When the astronomer Edwin Hubble found evidence for an expanding universe in the 1920s, Einstein was a holdout. Fixity was what he was attached to, and he liked the idea of a classical, steady universe. Overwhelming evidence from Hubble's findings finally compelled him to change his mind. I, for one, loved Pluto and was emotionally upset at its demotion. It fractured the tidy view of the solar system that I had come to love as a child. But then I came to understand that the accumulating data and our growing knowledge required the new categories of dwarf planets and planetesimals to be devised. And of course, now we have uncovered the possible existence of a brand new 9th planet that might well be lurking in the outskirts of our solar system. One never knows when even the smallest shifts and being open to change might lead us. Copernicus could never have imagined that we would one day build and send spacecraft, as we've done, the Voyagers 1 and 2, to stray beyond the sacred boundary of our solar system. What he did, though, was set in motion a sequence of radical ideas, each one of which challenged the one before and refined it to get us to where we are. Flexibility, curiosity, imagination, and the readiness to embrace change are unique cognitive gifts that we possess. Let's train our minds to stay nimble and make one leap as a monthly practice to rethink and maybe even suspend one of our cherished beliefs in the hope of gaining a new insight or even accepting a brand new idea or belief. As Immanuel Kant said, sapere aude, dare to think. Can't we all do a Kant? Yes, we can.
All right, good evening, everyone. My name is Alec Ross, and I'm the author of a relatively recently published book called The Industries of the Future that I bet you can find in the bookstore. After World War II, the United States made a massive investment in the K-12 education system in poor and working-class communities and vocational education so that people growing up in the kind of community that I grew up in West Virginia, or the kind of community that I taught in West Baltimore, could get jobs in our industrial-age businesses. My big idea is that we make a similarly massive and countrywide investment in technological education. The robots of the cartoons and movies from the 1970s are going to be the reality of the 2020s. And powerful artificial intelligence is now allowing for labor substitution for not just the work of men with strong shoulders working in ports, factories, mines, and mills. doing work that is manual and routine, but also doing work that is cognitive and non-routine. And work is evolving to a point where when you go to work, either you're telling a machine what to do or a machine is telling you what to do. And in the face of this, we need to make sure that all of our young people know how to code. Computer code is the vocabulary that much of the future is going to be written in. And in a world with so much opacity about our economic future, it is one area where we do know that there's going to be job growth. We've learned the hard way that humans are not as easy to upgrade as software. So we need to start early and we need to start young. Thank you.
My name is Shelley Pingree. I am a member of Congress from Maine, birthplace of Lois Rice. At about 11:30 on Wednesday morning, along with Congressman John Lewis of Georgia and a handful of my colleagues, I sat down on the floor of the House of Representatives. You're cutting into my time. My big idea is that no one should fear being shot just because that day they happen to be in a movie theater, a church, a nightclub, or God forbid, an elementary school. On Wednesday, our small group grew to include nearly all of the Democrats in the House. Members took turns sitting, speaking, listening, and eating a lot of cold pizza, Chinese food, and donuts. The Republicans chose to leave the floor, turned off the C-SPAN cameras and the microphones. But then something kind of magical happened. Sitting down sometimes is a way of standing up. And then some of the newer members taught John Lewis what Periscope was. That you could broadcast video from your iPhone and suddenly the world was watching. My colleagues told very personal stories of gun violence taking a good friend, their brother, their sister. In the early morning hours, one member brought in the 5 bullets that had once been extracted from her body. And she described the physical scars that she now carried. Over and over, I heard my normally staid colleagues say, I have never spoken about this in public. There were tears and pain and raw emotions. No one believes that there is just one solution that could cure the rampage of gun violence in our country. All we were asking for in those 24 hours was the chance to do our jobs, to debate and discuss, to take some votes on the floor. So my big idea is really a simple idea, that we don't fix a problem until we can at least name it. And the problem is that it's all too common for a normal day to be shattered by the sound of an assault rifle, and we've given up thinking we can do something about it. So sometimes sitting down is the best idea you've got. Sometimes sitting down and stopping the action is the only way to give Americans a chance to share their big ideas. Thank you.
Hi, my name is Jose Antonio Vargas. I'm the founder of both Emerging Us and Define American. And my big idea is actually also a favor. I need all of you to come out. Let me explain. I've come out twice in my life. The first time was in 1999. I was a high school junior, and I was in the closet about 2 things. I knew that I was here illegally, and I knew that I was gay. I had to come out of one of the closets. So thankfully, my history teacher showed us The Life and Times of Harvey Milk, the documentary. And after the film was shown, I raised my hand and told all my classmates I'm gay. So that was the first coming out. But the fact is, the coming out of LGBT people changed the culture in which we understood gay lives in this country. But it's not just LGBT people who needed and needs to come out. It's straight people, right? Remember the fact that for many years, the #1 show on network television was Will and Grace. For every will, there's a grace. Right? And that kind of cultural shift led to the political shift that exactly a year ago today was the victory of same-sex marriage in the Supreme Court. Exactly a year ago today. And that is the kind of cultural shift that is much needed in the way we talk about immigration in this country. I am one of the millions of undocumented immigrants who would have benefited from President Obama's executive order on immigration. That executive order would have allowed me to travel outside of the US for the first time in my adult life and to see a mother who I haven't seen since I was 12. So I haven't seen her for 23 years. But last Thursday, the Supreme Court's announced a split decision, which was really a non-decision, which meant that millions of us are still in limbo. 5 years ago this month, I came out for the second time, and that time as an undocumented immigrant. Since I'm not one of the 2 million immigrants that President Obama has deported, I've been keeping busy. I've been traveling around the country, engaging Republicans, Democrats, Donald Trump supporters, asking them a really important question, which is, how do you define American? Is it laws? The same law that happened when we banned Germans and Italians to this country? Is it pieces of papers? Is my being a citizen actually relegated to a piece of paper that I don't have? And to me, the bigger question is, why can't we fully come out collectively about the root causes of migration? Why do we put a sign out to the US-Mexico border saying, keep out, and then 10 yards in, what do we say? Job wanted, right? I need collectively for all of us to come out and be real and be honest about these issues. I mean, we're here. We're paying taxes and Social Security. We know that we mow your lawns and babysit your kids and serve you drinks. You know that we actually go to the same colleges that you do and worship at the same churches that you do. And I'm actually one of the many undocumented business owners. I have an idea for you, Mr. Bradley. And undocumented people can actually be a business owner. Now, here's the question. Will you help change the culture in which we understand immigration? In this election in which American identity itself is at stake, how do you define American? And lastly, will you come out with us and support us? Thank you for having me.
I'm glad my idea follows on nicely. Salam, everyone, which means peace. My name is Ruba. I'm half Syrian, half Lebanese. I live between Beirut and London, and I founded the first organization working with Syrian refugees. So today there are about 12 million human beings who are stateless, meaning having no citizenship. The number of refugees around the world is at an unprecedented 65.3 million people. Add to that the fact that we are all becoming increasingly displaced and increasingly recognizing that, in the words of my friend and hero, the late Joe Cox, we all have more in common than ever before. Thank you. Think of the discontentment over Brexit and of the more and more of us who can't identify with our governments, systems, and laws. Think, for instance, of the millions of Americans who won't identify anymore if Donald Trump wins the election. There is an awakening worldwide of our sense of responsibility towards our shared planet and our shared humanity, but also that our systems are failing in providing the young and aspiring generations with what they long for. Now, imagine a world where we can all instead identify with our core, not with our inherited borders, politics, religion, or other, but as humans, to identify ourselves with our passions and longings, to all, with no exception, have equal access to political, economic rights, virtual assets, and services. That would be cool, right? Certainly, globalization might be on its end, but how about a virtual globalization and how to bring it back, as Walter Isaacson said, to leave no one out? My big idea is one that I intend to start exploring this summer at Singularity University. It is to include and empower the stateless, the refugees, the humanists, those who recognize this increasing need and value of being global despite all the obstacles. I propose developing a virtual citizenship in an increasingly online and connected world by leveraging exponential technologies to empower the citizenless and to allow the citizens to forge new identities, to form vibrant communities, and to think about citizenship and identity in new ways and in fluid dimensions. So if you like my ideas, drop me a line or talk to me over a coffee. I would love for you to challenge me and help me through this idea. Thank you very much.
My name is Cory Booker. Thank you. It is a twisted and perverse privilege that thinks an urgency or a really serious problem is not really a problem unless it affects me personally. I was that kind of guy. I grew up in a very affluent neighborhood. I went to Stanford and Oxford and Yale, but 20 years ago, I moved into an American inner city. And I began to hear things with a chilling regularity. constant, unyielding gunfire. My neighbors would tell their children to stay away from windows. I would meet kids who had traumatic shock from witnessing unrelenting violence. All over my streets, in the streets of cities all across this country, are these little shrines, candles, and teddy bears where our children have died. My neighbors in the building that I lived in fell to gun violence. Hassan, the young boy that lived 4 floors below me, dead. Miss Bradley, right in front of her children, was killed. And then I had the experience of watching gunfire and violence myself as a mayor, on videotape after videotape, walking with my dad when gunshots rung out, with a boy on the ground trying desperately to keep him alive as blood poured from his chest, foamy blood from his mouth. When I was mayor, I used to tell people coming into me with ideas or philosophies, I used to say, in God we trust, but everybody else bring me data. I want to see the numbers. Well, the numbers are clear. We've had more people die to gun deaths in our country since 9/11 than all the people dying in combat deaths in World War II from our nation. We now have a nation that in the time that this wonderful weekend finishes, there will be more than an Orlando 3X to people dying from gun violence in communities where people live with unrelenting fear. And I also know the data that shows we can do something about this. In states like mine in New Jersey that pass common sense gun regulation, gun deaths go down. In fact, not only homicides go down, but women who die at the hands of their intimates goes down dramatically. Suicides go down, but the challenge is, what often goes up is gun smuggling from other states, like we see in Chicago and in Newark and in Camden and in neighborhoods in New York. And so King said so eloquently, to paraphrase him, he said, we will have to repent in this day and age, not just for the vitriolic words and violent actions of the bad people, but the appalling silence and inaction of the good people. That's us. And so why don't we have background checks when 84% of Americans who are gun owners believe in background checks, when over 70% of Congress who are resisting this see no consequence because good people are not acting to make it more than this, though, those of us who are privileged are now seeing this gun violence come into our communities like never before. The rapidity and frequency of mass shootings are beginning to give people a taste of what the drumbeat of shootings going on in poor places with poor people are experiencing. From our schools, from Columbine to Newtown, from our neighborhoods and workplaces like San Bernardino, to our churches like Charleston. Now we see a challenge where the very enemy we have declared war against is telling people that they're trying to radicalize, to go to America or stand up in America because they have lax gun laws. Exploit them. Well, these terrorists now have open doors to getting weapons. As the GAO has said, between 2004 and 2014, over 2,000 suspected terrorists tried to buy weapons, and 91% were able to get them. And so what will change this? Edmund Burke said the only thing necessary for evil to be triumphant is for good people to do nothing. So what's my big idea? I've long since come to realize that the biggest thing we can do in any day is most often going to be a small act of decency, kindness, and love. We cannot, as a nation, allow our inability to do everything to undermine our determination to do something. We cannot, as a nation, get caught up in a state of sedentary agitation when we're upset about what's going on, or willing to applaud a congresswoman or a senator. We are upset, but we don't get up and do something about it that we didn't do yesterday, because we all have a choice to make in every moment of our lives to accept things as they are or take responsibility for changing them. And now we as a nation are going into July 4th. How will our symbols and substance of patriotism really be shown? Will it be through our songs and our flag pins? Or will it be a remembrance that this purpose of this nation in the preamble of our Constitution was founded for the common defense and domestic tranquility? I ask you now as I close, how will we be patriots this year? Will we deplore the violence, or will we act against it? It was a great man who spoke for poor and marginalized people through his poetry, who made a challenge to us Americans, simple words, where he said, "America never has been America to me, but I swear this oath, America will be." My big idea is that we Americans stop talking about change or hoping for change or deploring those actors who don't make it. And we decide to be Americans in the most common and great tradition of our country, that we be about change and show our patriotism through loving action. Thank you.
Okay, I'm going to be fast. It's a hard act to follow. It is such a privilege for us to create this program every summer, bringing to you the individuals we believe who are the most remarkable thinkers, doers, leaders, and experts across so many fields, to introduce you to their ideas and their actions and their thoughts. And to all of our presenters here tonight, and to those who presented us big ideas, I can't thank you enough. Thank you so much. It's a privilege. Just quickly, we can't produce this festival without our underwriters, who you'll meet in exhibits and everything across the week. We want to thank our patrons, and if our scholars could stand, although I know people want to leave, our patrons have allowed us to bring 300 scholars from all over the world here over 10 days. Thank you so much. We made a big initiative this year to make more of the ideas accessible to youth. And thanks to the Bezos Family Foundation, we have 100 kids here from cities across the country, building ideas festivals in other places, winning competitions to be here. We also have the National Alliance of Scholars in the Arts here. I hope you'll get to meet them. Thank you to Jackie and Mike and to our arts program for bringing these kids. And tomorrow afternoon, we have our first ever Ideas Forum for youth. Already 250 kids are going, and you're not allowed to go if you're over 21, but your kids can go if they're under 21. I have the unfortunate job of having to do some housekeeping, and that is, we are very serious about security. You've asked us to be, we are. If you don't show up with your pass, we will ask you to go get it. That means leaving campus, that means leaving campus. Do wear your pass, you will be asked to leave. We're in a high security situation, and we're taking it very, very seriously. If there are changes to the schedule, as there were today, the app on our iPhone is critical. So please pay attention to that. June 28th is already completely redone. This is the best place to find it. That next big idea, let's go on to our reception at Dora Hosier. Thank you so much for this afternoon. Thank you.